White communities in Africa post-apartheid. The dawn of democracy in Africa marked a seismic shift in the continent's socio-political landscape, particularly for nations like South Africa and Zimbabwe, where the legacies of colonialism and apartheid loomed large. Mandela, 1995, Ndlovu Gatsheni, 2013. In these countries, the brutal realities of racial segregation were not just historical footnotes but living, breathing traumas that affected millions. For white communities post-apartheid, this period was a reckoning, a confrontation with their history that was not just about admitting past wrongs, but also about redefining their place in a rapidly changing world. Steyn, 2001. For many white South Africans, transitioning from apartheid was a painful awakening. The systemic superiority that once guaranteed wealth, power, and privilege was no longer assured. The new South Africa, founded on principles of equity, demanded that white citizens rethink their identities, not as rulers but as equals. Some embraced the challenge of equity and integration, recognizing that their place at the table was not a birthright but a shared space earned through mutual respect and recognition of past injustices. Tutu, 1999. However, others resisted, clinging to enclaves of privilege, shielding themselves from the realities of a diverse society. Steyn, 2001. Many white South Africans retreated into gated communities, attending private schools and exclusive clubs that served as new lines of separation. These spaces allowed them to evade confronting their historical roles while maintaining distance from the narrative of shared power and responsibility. Durkheim et al., 2011. Despite the political shift, psychological and social divides remain deeply entrenched, fueling tension that still reverberates in modern South African society. In Zimbabwe, the early 2000s brought land reforms that intensified racial divides. Many white Zimbabweans, who had inherited vast farmlands during colonial rule, faced expropriation without compensation under President Robert Mugabe's controversial land redistribution program, Moyo, 2000. While some viewed these actions as a necessary correction of historical wrongs, others saw them as retribution. This process forced white Zimbabweans to reimagine their role in a society where they were no longer the dominant minority. For those willing to confront the past, this was an opportunity to rebuild relationships and engage in dialogue about equality and justice. However, for many, the displacement led to an exodus of white Zimbabweans fleeing to countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Raftopoulos and Imlambo, 2009. The land reforms also intensified debates about justice and reparations, challenging notions of fairness in post-colonial governance. Personal stories, voices from post-apartheid South Africa. 1. The bitter legacy. Andrew's story. Andrew grew up in Johannesburg during apartheid in a privileged white family that never questioned the system. His father was a successful businessman whose wealth was built on the backs of black laborers, and his mother hosted garden parties that never saw a guest of color. For Andrew, apartheid was the backdrop of his childhood, an unchallenged norm that granted him an easy, comfortable life. Steyn, 2001. As apartheid ended, Andrew's world shifted. No longer insulated by the walls of privilege, he was forced to confront a history his family had always ignored. Today, Andrew is haunted by the knowledge that his prosperity was rooted in a brutal system designed to suppress millions. He has spent years in therapy, grappling with guilt and anger at his parents for keeping him ignorant, anger at himself for not questioning sooner, and anger at a society that still harbors resentment and division. Durkheim et al., 2011. Andrew has tried to make amends in his ways, dedicating himself to social justice work and investing in black-owned businesses. Yet, reconciliation feels elusive. The bitterness lingers, a reminder of the scars that cannot be undone by mere acknowledgement. Andrew's family, still stuck in their ways, refuses to discuss the past, branding him a traitor for questioning the legacy they built. For Andrew, The way forward is a lonely path of seeking forgiveness, not from those around him, but from the conscience that keeps him up at night. Steyn, 2001. 2. The weight of injustice. Lindeway's journey. Lindeway was just a child when apartheid ended, but the memories are seared into her mind. Her family lived in a cramped township outside Cape Town, where opportunities were scarce, and survival was a daily battle. Lindeway's father was a freedom fighter, and she remembers the nights when he would come home bloodied and broken, refusing to give up the dream of a free South Africa. Mandela, 1995. The end of apartheid brought hope, but it also brought new challenges. Lindeway's family, like many black South Africans, struggled to find their footing in a world that had promised equality but delivered little in the way of reparations. Education was supposed to be the great equalizer, but her schools were underfunded and overcrowded, a far cry from the elite institutions her white peers attended. Jobs were still hard to come by, and the wealth that had been hoarded for generations remained out of reach. Raftopoulos and Mlambo, 2009. Today, Lindeway is a social worker determined to uplift her community despite the obstacles. She carries a deep, simmering anger at the white families who still enjoy the fruits of their ancestors' exploitation, anger at a government that has not done enough to close the gaps, and anger at a society that expects her to forgive without ever truly addressing her wounds. Yet, there is also pride in her heritage, her resilience, and the progress made, even if it feels like a drop in the ocean. Tutu, 1999. Lindeway's way forward is rooted in action. She fights for change, not just through her work but in every conversation, every vote, and every protest. She refuses to let her children grow up in a world that whispers to them they are still less than. For Lindeway, the future is a promise she will not let break, even if she must fight for it every day. Mandela, 1995. 3. The fragile hope. Peter's reckoning. Peter's grandparents were farmers in the Eastern Cape, staunch defenders of apartheid who believed that the system was essential to maintaining order. Peter grew up hearing stories of the glory days, when his family's land was vast, and their labor was cheap. As a teenager, he would ride horses through fields that stretched endlessly, never once considering the cost of his freedom. Steyn, 2001. As Peter grew older, he began to see the cracks. He met black South Africans who had lived through horrors he could hardly imagine, whose families had been displaced, and whose opportunities had been stolen. When apartheid ended, Peter watched his grandfather rage against the changes, cursing the new government and the injustice of land reforms that threatened to redistribute what he considered his rightful inheritance. Raftopoulos and Mlambo, 2009. Today, Peter is torn. He loves his family, but he cannot deny the truth of their history. He has chosen to be vocal about the need for reparations, even as his parents dismiss him as naive. Peter's friends accuse him of being overly dramatic and trying too hard to absolve himself of guilt they believe isn't his. But Peter knows better. He knows that his privilege was built on the suffering of others, and he refuses to ignore that reality. Mbembe, 2008. Peter's way forward is fraught with tension. He has sold a portion of his family's land to local black farmers, a gesture that was met with outrage by his relatives. He works with community organizations to promote dialogue between races, believing that conversations, though painful, are the only path to true reconciliation. He holds on to hope, fragile though it may be, that his country can heal if enough people are willing to face the truth. Mandela, 1995. For generations, white privilege in Africa was an unspoken birthright, a golden ticket that guaranteed safety, wealth, and an elevated place in society. Steyn, 2001. However, as the tides of change swept across the continent, particularly in post-apartheid South Africa, that privilege began to crumble. Durkheim et al., 2011. Many white South Africans, like Peter and Andrew, now face the truth that their wealth was built on stolen land and the exploitation of black labor. Mbembe, 2008. Despite this, some continue to resist the inevitable power shift. Enclaves of privilege persist where apartheid's legacy lingers in private clubs, exclusive schools, and gated communities. These spaces serve as stark reminders that while apartheid as a legal institution may have fallen, its social and economic legacy remains intact. Steyn, 2001.